Good morning, sir. Good morning, classmates. I am Marielyn Gabane, the reporter of Part 4 Languages and the Mind. In number 16, the neurolinguistic, according to David Kaplan, the field of neurolinguistic has come to consist of the two related areas of study, language disorder, which is sometimes called apathology, and the relationship between language and the brain. Apathology has made important to discoveries about what goes wrong with language after brain damage, some of which have implication for what language is and how it is processed. Apathology is closely linked to the study of the relationship between language and the brain. In apathology, in a brief history of apathology, Paul Broca's presentation to Anthropological Society of Paris of the now famous case of Lieberge, Broca 1861, started and defined both apathology and neurolinguistics. Broca's case was a 57-year-old man who had come into the hospital 21 years earlier unable to speak. He could only utter the syllable tan. He appeared able to understand what people said to him, and he could express his needs and emotion through gesture and by changing the tone of his voice. In Broca's analysis of language disorder in Tan, was thus and lost his faculty of articulate speech while retaining the faculty for language comprehension, and thus for production of recognition of meaningful gesture. With the analysis, Broca's defined the approach to aphasia that's dominated medical and scientific thinking for the kids to think of language disorder as disorder of the ability to use language in the usual task of speaking, understanding, reading, and writing. So that is the apathology in according to Broca's analysis. With this analysis, Broca's defined the approach to the dominated medical and scientific thinking for the kids to think of language disorder of the ability to use language in the usual task of speaking, understanding, and writing. So this approach focuses attention on the common task by which linguistic-based communication take place. So, we can show in table number 16.1 the classic aphasic syndromes. In syndromes of Broca's aphasia, his clinical manifestation is major disturbance in speech production with sparse, halting speech, often misarticulated, frequently missing function words and bound morphemes. And Broca's aphasia and his hypothetical deficit is disturbances in the speech planning and production mechanism. And his classical lesion location is primarily posterior aspects of the frontal and adjacent aspect. So that is the Broca's syndrome and his analysis. So, the syndrome of Wernicke's aphasia, his clinical manifestation is major disturbance in auditory comprehension, fluent speech with disturbances of the sounds and structure of words, phonemic, morphonological, and semantic paraphasias. And his hypothetical deficit, disturbances of the permanent representation of the sound structure of words, and his classical lesion location, posterior half of the first temporal gesture and possibly adjacent context. So that is the syndrome of Wernicke's aphasia. And the syndrome of anomic aphasia, his clinical manifestation is disturbance in production of single words, most marked for common noun with variable comprehension problems. And his hypothetical deficit is disturbances of the conceive and or the sounds patterns of words, and his classical lesion location is inferior parietal lobe or connections between parietal lobe and temporal lobe. And also, the syndrome of global aphasia, his clinical manifestation is major disturbance in all language functions, and his hypothetical deficit is disruption of all language processing components, and his classical lesion location is large portion of the perisyllabian association context. And also, the syndrome of conduction aphasia, his syndrome aphasia and his clinical manifestation, his disturbance of repetition and spontaneous speech, phonemic paraphasia, and also his hypothetical deficit is disconnection between the sounds, patterns of words, and speech production mechanism. And also his classical lesion location is lesion in the accurate fasciculus and or cortical connection between temporal and frontal lobes. And the syndrome of transcortical aphasia, his clinical manifestation is disturbance and spontaneous speech similar to Broca's aphasia with relatively preserved repetition. And his hypothetical deficit is disconnection between conceptual representation of words and sentence and the motor speech production system. And his classical lesion location with matter tracks decades to deep to Broca's area. And also the syndrome of transcortical sensory aphasia, his clinical manifestation is disturbance in single word comprehension with relatively intact repetition, and his hypothetical deficit is disturbance in activation of word meaning despite normal recognition of auditory presented words. And also his classical lesion location, his white matter tracts connecting parietal lobe to temporal lobe or in portion of inferior parietal lobe. So, next is the syndrome of isolation of the language zone. His clinical manifestation is disturbance of both spontaneous speech similar to Broca's aphasia and comprehension with some preservation of repetition, and his hypothetical deficit is disconnection between concept and both representation and word sound of the speech production mechanism. And also his classical lesion location is cortex just outside the perisalvian association cortex. So that's it, the syndrome in the Table class, in Table 16.1, the classic aphasic syndrome. So that their analysis. So this syndrome mainly refer the relative ability of patients to perform language tasks, speaking comprehension, etc., not the integrity of specific components of the language processing system. For instance, the speech production problems in Broca's aphasia can consist of one or more of large number of impairments disorder affecting articulation such as dysphagia or apraxia speech. In number 1, linguistic structure of sign language. First, we examine the structure of the sentence, syntax, and then move the structure of the smaller units of language, thus that they may be compared to the meaningless but identifiable sounds of speech. It is phonology. We will end the linguistic description with a discussion of the structure of words, which is morphology. When we first to structure the sentence, we can call that syntax. In the we can identify the meaning or speech. We call that is monology, phonology. If the discussion is the end, we call that is morphology. So in 1.1 sentence structure, which is we call that is syntax. One of the fundamental properties of human language is that can be used to create an unlimited number of utterances given a limited number of pieces. Next is at the syntactic level, this property follows directly from a mathematical property of language called recursion. We're all familiar with recursion, even if not with the term. It is found in language and computer program and even in children's stories. So we call that is syntax. So this is the farmer sowing the corn, that keep, that cock the crow in the morn, that wicked, the breast of shaven and sworn, that Marielyn man all at or tattered and turned, that kissed the maiden all fallen, that milked the cow with the crumpled horn, that tossed the dog, that worried the cat, that killed the rat, that ate the malt, that lit the house, that Jack built. So that is the example of the syntax. So the process or role that creates a relative clause. Here the clause is beginning with that is applied repeatedly to the noun phrases. Inside other relative clauses, this repeated application of the same role to create more and more complex sentences is an example of recursion. So that is an example of recursion. So, number 2, this the banker his honor forsworn, that foreclosed on the farmer sowing the corn. The only limited on the number of relative clauses are practical and not linguistic. The speaker may run out of things to say or out of breath or time or memory. It is because the rules of syntax are allowed to apply recursively that language is notified. There is no limit to its expressive power. So in number 3, this is a dog. This is the example of the syntax. The dog roared the cat, and the cat killed the rest, and the rat ate the malt, lay in the house, and Jack built the house. Embedding distinguished subordinate clauses of the sort exemplified by the house that Jack built from the simple coordination. So, a simplified diagram of the structure of recursive subordinate versus coordinate clauses is given in figure 18.1. The role that makes a relative clauses put a sentence inside a noun phrase produces a structure in which one sentence is inside another sentence. So, next is number 17, which is called is psycholinguistic. Psycholinguistics is human language is seated in each and every normally developed neurologically healthy human mind. It is the outward expression of language, however, with which most people are familiar language comprehension and production during the course of spoken, sign, or written communication. Noam Chomsky has often said that is that if people could simply beam thought directly into each other's brains, we would have no need for language nor for the intricacies of monology, morphology, syntax, and the other subcomponents of language elucidated in the chapter of this volume. So, number one, psycholinguistics as a field study. According to Fernanda Ferreira, described the relationship between formal linguistic and psycholinguistic as a complicated family relationship, and interested readers are urged to refer to Ferreira's accessible outline of how two fields have complemented over the past 60 plus years since the cognitive revolution, and her advice as to how two family reunions somewhat less awkward. So this theoretical difference is perspective is reflected in the tension is psycholinguistic between bottom-up processing and top-down processing for an excellent discussion of this tension in all aspects of cognition. So that is a psycholinguistic as a field study in the thought of Fernanda Ferreira. So in his describing. So in 1.2, the structure of sound and their sign language equivalent phonology. In order to have sentences, one must have word and words. At least in spoken language are pronounced a series of sounds. What about the sign of sign language? Do they have a level-old structure like the spoken word? Since spoken and sign languages are produced and perceived by different physical systems, oral and manual or visual, one might expect to the least amount of similarity across the two modalities of this level of analysis. Yet here is much common ground. That is the structure of sounds in the phonology. So in 1960, William Stock published a monography in which we demonstrated that the word of American Sign Language are not holistic gesture, but rather are analyzable as a combination of three meaningless yet linguistically significant categories: handshake, location, and moments. So that is why changing some feature of any one of those three categories in a sign language themselves meaningless, one could change the meaning of the sign. Next is number 2, language production. Truth is instantaneous and holistic, but speech is necessarily sequential and segmental. A great deal of research in language production has sought to clarify how amorphous thought gets sequenced out to the bottleneck of linear speech. Language production thus appears to involve a degree of planning, but it is important to note that no one believes entire sentences are planned out before speaking commences in normal conversational setting, although it is not yet known for certain what the range of planning is. A good approximation appears to be more or less one close. So next is sign language. So that is a production that first involved a degree of planning. In sign language linguistic, it is intonation. Is different from the facial expression. Intonation is a different in facial expression used by hearing people in their communication, which are effective and mandatory or systematic. Rather than linguistic, facial expressions of signs language are like the intonational pitch patterns of spoken language. So intonation is different to the facial expression in sign language. So language comprehension. Imagine that you want to learn about how a car engine works, so you find an engine that is running smoothly and you open the hood. What would you learn by simply watching the engine running at its normal speed? The answer is like not too much, simply because the engine is running very fast, and the connection between the various parts are too tightly linked to observe with the naked eye. When it comes to structural ambiguity, temporarily has proven to be particularly useful in slowing down in the language comprehension system without forcing its grind to a complete halt in the form of irreconcilable confusion. Through see the discussion of interpretation below for some new findings. So, 1.3 word structure is morphology. Most languages have both simply words such as teach and complex words such as teach or plus er. Knowing a language entails understanding the internal structure of its complex words, as well as the ability to create and understand new complex words that exploit those same kinds of internal structure. The study of the internal structure of word is called morphology. Sign language have a great deal of morphological complicity. Such complicity is one of many sources of evidence that systematic grammatical structuring strongly influences the presumably iconic origin of these languages. We will describe two kinds of word complexity here: verb agreement and verb of motion and location. That is the morphology. Are different to the sign language are different to the gesture. So this kind of phenomenon can be described as a subject-object agreement. In particular language, verbs agree for person and number of their subject and object. In this way, the verb agreement found in sign language is similar to that in many spoken languages. A characteristic of verb agreement system is sign language is that different categories of verb participate in the system in different ways. For example, in addition to the subject-object agreement described earlier, some verbs commonly called backwards verb, and the opposite agreement pattern to the one shown above. A more complex type of morphology in sign language is found in type of construction called classifier predicates. In this construction, handshift that stand for classes of nouns combined with different types of manners of movement and with location in space. So this is the kind of phenomenon that describes the example, and we can show our expression in our language to the other words. So, number 2, language as an art form. So, sign language poetry. Poetry takes language far beyond its primary task for everyday communication. By artfully manipulating the forms that meaning of language, the poet conveys a particular or understanding of human experience. Devices such as meter, rhyme, and alliteration may filter the meaningful contents of a poem in order to create an impression or focus on an image in the mind of the audience. A conventional meaning may be intentionally distorted in such a way to distance the perspective the poet wishes to present. So, sign language, we call that is a poetry. That is the meaningful language. That is the art. We call that the art in our language. What we can see, it is the art. So, number 4, development psycholinguistic. One of the most basic defining question in both linguistic and psycholinguistics is how children come to acquire and use language. Accordingly, there is a long history of empirical investigation into how children process language at all levels of analysis. A primary concern of this research has been to determine whether the language processing of young children differs from that adult, and if so, how. So that is the development psycholinguistic. Number 5, applied psycholinguistic, although the term applied linguistic can refer to several fields where limit the discussion here to second foreign language processing. It is only recently that a truly psycholinguistic has been developed for language processing by non-native speakers. Applied linguistics is a field wrought with the implication, unlike development psycholinguistics, in which research subject, infants and children, are considered to be relatively homogeneous and limited in their experience. Adult 1.2 speakers varies myriad ways, age and education first language. In 1.1 literacy level, in 1.2 and 1.1 proficiency level, working memory capacity, and other cognitive capacities, etc. So perhaps this is why earlier applied psycholinguistic research rarely utilized the same method and psycholinguistic research which is monolingual. Next is number 18 in sign languages. So it has been over 50 years since serious investigation of sign languages began to show that these languages are bona fide linguistic system with structure and role and the full range and expressive power that characterize spoken languages. So next is researchers have spent most of the time demonstrating with increasing rigor and normality the sometimes surprising similarities between languages and the two modalities, spoken and sign. Concomitantly, scholars is related disciplines like language and acquisition and neurolinguistics have been discovering significant similarities between spoken and sign languages in these domains as well. So the sign language under discussion are the language used by communities of deaf people all over the world. They are natural language in the sense that they are not consciously invented by anyone, but rather develop spontaneously wherever deaf people have an opportunity to congregate and communicate regularly with each other. Sign language are not derived from spoken language. They have their own independent vocabularies and their own grammatical structures, although there exist contrived sign systems that are based on spoken languages, such as Sign English, Sign Hebrew, etc. Such systems are not natural languages and they are not of interest here. So sign language are important to the deaf people to understand what you want or what you want to say. So when we are speak or sign to the deaf people, so we need to the sign language to understand what you say. Rather, linguistic and cognitive psycholinguistic are most interested in the natural sign language passed down without instruction from one deaf generation to the next and used by deaf people in their own communities all over the world. Sign languages exhibit the full range of expression that spoken languages afford. Their user different styles are adapted for different social contexts. University lectures are delivered in or translated to sign language. Storytelling has been heightened to an art in some deaf communities. Deaf poets create artistic poetry in sign, marshalling the formational elements of the languages to convey image, emotion, and ideas. So, linguistic structure of sign language. First, we examine the structure that the sentence or syntax, and then move to the structure and the smaller units of language, those that may be compared to the meaningless but identifiable sounds of speech is monology. We will end the linguistic description with discussion of the structure word work. We call that is morphology. So that is the sign languages. So syntax structure. One of the fundamental properties of human language is that it can be used to create an unlimited number of utterances given a limited number of pieces. And the syntax level, this poetry follows directly from mathematical poetry of language called recursion, where the family is recursion even if not with the term. Sound languages and the computer languages. So that is our sentences structure syntax. So that is the how to understand the sentence or the syntax of our syntax and monology or morphology in the sign language in our how to teach to understand to the people. So very important this. So and that's all. Thank you for listening. God bless you.